Hey everyone, Mr. Lapeze here once again. That first video was just basically hitting the highlights of the SN1 prompt. This time I want to give you some thoughts about how to get started, how to actually, isolate the prompt and start formulating some ideas that we can eventually turn into paragraphs. So what I like to do is to not be distracted. All this other stuff, how much it's worth and when it's due, is so important. But it also can distract us by just getting a bunch of other text on the screen when we're trying to write. So what I like to do is sort of highlight the prompt itself. What am I going to be writing about? And start fresh on a new Word document, just to get rid of all the noise and focus on the prompt itself. So this is what we're doing. We're choosing one of these four terms, and we're going to craft an extended definition. So what I would do first is think about these four terms and think about, which one do I really want to write about? You can always change your mind as you're drafting, but you need to settle on one. It says choose one of the following four terms, so we can't choose two or three or all four. So let's just say I am looking at the terms and I'm like, I'm interested in suffering. I'm suffering to write this paper. I have suffered already this semester, and I want to explore what it means to suffer in my 3+ page paper. So what I might do next is work on a thesis statement. It's going to be the main idea. It's going to be the thing that sort of gives rise to all of those claims and examples that follow in body paragraphs. So I might do something like this and just roughly scratch out something I can use while brainstorming and outlining. So thesis statement, a definition means what? This means this, or this is this. So I might say something like, suffering involves painful experiences. And if I stop there, I'd be like, all right, I can maybe do something with that. But it also seems a little curt. It seems a little short. It seems too brief, for a paper that's going to be 3+ pages at minimum, double-spaced. So I might ask why, how, I might add a because in here. I might investigate the types of painful experiences. So let's do that. So suffering involves painful experiences that tend to be type of painful experiences. How do we suffer? Suffering involves painful experiences that tend to be emotional, for sure, emotional suffering. We can suffer physically, right? We all do that. We hurt ourselves. And then there's another type, I would say, that we could for sure suffer psychologically, mentally, like in our thoughts. And that's sort of interesting. I don't know right now while I'm brainstorming how exactly I'm going to differentiate between psychological and emotional suffering, but I think I can do it. I think there's a difference between the sort of inner torment I feel in my brain sometimes when I'm trying to make a decision, for example, or when I'm trying to decide whether, one option is best. So yeah, I think suffering, and that's different than being, emotionally suffering, from something emotionally painful. So we've got suffering involves painful experiences that tend to be emotional, physical, let's revise that, or psychological. That's pretty good. Suffering involves painful experiences that tend to be emotional, physical, or psychological. And let's just say I'm like, all right, so that gives me, I know I can get a body paragraph. I can write a body paragraph about emotional suffering, physical suffering, and psychological suffering. And I'm thinking I got to get at least 3 full pages double-spaced. So maybe I need 4 body paragraphs. I don't know how long they're going to be yet. I haven't started writing. I tend to err on the side of caution. So I'm going to add something else to this thesis that might give me another body paragraph. So I've got suffering involves painful experiences that tend to be emotional, physical, or psychological. And then I said something like this, and these experiences change as people grow older and mature. Because I'm thinking like, all right, so suffering is different. There's a difference between, I have young children, so I'm thinking there's a difference between a 5-year-old suffering, and then I have another child who's about 10-year-old suffering, and the type of suffering I experience as an adult, as their parent. And then I can reflect on, what kind of suffering do people even older than that? My children's grandparents, my parents, and my father and mother-in-law, their definition of suffering would probably be quite different than mine, and ours are, as adults, is quite different from my children. So if I want to sort of like sketch out the sort of scope of suffering and how emotional, physical, and psychological suffering sort of evolve as we grow older, that might be a good paragraph. So I've got a pretty specific thesis statement. It took me a little while, and it might take you longer. And then from here, I want to think, what am I going to get body paragraphs out of? Like, where can I see specifically ideas or terms or phrases that need to be explored more deeply? And I see 1, 2, 3, 4 ideas that I can absolutely explore in depth in body paragraphs that sort of demand more details and examples. So what I like to do is, once I get a thesis statement I'm pretty happy with, I always go back and add details, tinker with it, all that stuff. I like to say, all right, where are my ideas for body paragraphs? And then I like, personally, to number them. So let's just say I want to get an emotional suffering. Paragraph. I want to get a physical suffering paragraph. I want to get a psychological suffering paragraph down. And I want to explore in another body paragraph how suffering changes over time. So now I've got my thesis statement. I have ideas that I know are directly tied to the thesis statement. And then if I go back and look at the prompt, it says craft an extended definition. So my definition says that suffering can be emotional, physical, and psychological. These are all different types. And they can change as we age, as we go from childhood to adulthood to the elderly stages of our life. And it says consisting of a combination of claims and examples. So what I might want to do before I actually start writing my paper, before I get into my introduction, I get my thesis statement into my introduction, and I start working body paragraphs out of these ideas, is remind myself I need claims and examples. A claim for emotional suffering. What is it? What does the experience feel like, look like, etc.? And then an example. What's an example of emotional suffering? Right off the top of my head, the pain one feels during a breakup or at a funeral. And then I can say, all right, so I've got emotional suffering. I will have some ideas, and then I will have those ideas supported by examples. So I'm kind of basically walking the prompt and making sure I hit all of the terms that my teacher is asking me. Extended definition, so I've got 4 paragraphs explaining the different facets of the term I chose. And each paragraph is going to have a combination of claims and examples. So what is emotional suffering? Emotional suffering is this. It's going to take me a couple sentences to do that. What does the experience look like and feel like? And once I have those claims down, those arguments about emotional suffering, I will explain them even further with some examples. And if I can do this for emotional suffering, physical suffering, You get the idea. Psychological suffering. I'll basically have broken down the term I chose into 3 different parts. It could be more depending on the term you choose. The 4 different types of endurance, of adventures, of salvation. And then I get another paragraph that basically makes my definition even more specific. The more specific your definition, the better the paper is going to be. So I'm not just saying that these are the 3 facets of suffering. I'm also saying that these 3 facets will change, will evolve, look quite different as we move over the course of a human life, from youth to adulthood to the elderly stages, the older stages of a human life. I'll explain why or how, and I will give examples in each of my body paragraphs. And my thesis statement, of course, will be housed inside an introduction. An introduction has a few roles. We've read about this in our rules for writers. One is to introduce the topic, and the other thing is to engage the audience before you introduce your thesis statement. Got my thesis statement there, and then I know once I develop all my body paragraphs, I'm going to have a conclusion paragraph. My conclusion paragraph, I always think of these as the hardest to write. You know, you have to walk the line, and that's what I'm going to type here actually anyway. You want to walk the line between repetition, no copy and paste, right? You don't want to just copy and paste early ideas. You don't want to just repeat word for word or nearly word for word something you said earlier. The paper's not that long, it's not necessary. So you want to walk the line between repetition and getting off topic. So how do you stay on topic without repeating yourself? Paraphrasing is a good idea. Perhaps introduce another example that stays on topic. Perhaps that's usually a good way to end. Consider questions for further exploration. Somebody who reads your paper and they get to your conclusion, what might they be asking? You know, is there a type of suffering that maybe you haven't considered? Is there an example that maybe doesn't clearly fit 1 or 2 or 3 of these examples? Maybe a question like, can suffering fall into 2 or even 3 of these categories? Does it usually? Why and how? Because I would say, you know, if I'm isolating emotional, physical, and psychological suffering in individual body paragraphs, somebody's going to say, well, yeah, what about the time I actually experienced the example you provide in your second body paragraph, physical suffering? I actually did get hit by a car, and I broke a femur and a few vertebrae, and it wasn't just physical. It was a combination. There was some psychological suffering, there was emotional suffering. What about that? You know, because you sort of presented them as isolated. Maybe in your conclusion paragraph, you might explore, you know, how they sort of blur. The experience of each type of suffering blurs into the other. Something like that, where you're staying on topic, but you're sort of saying, like, look, my definition here, for whatever term you chose, is not the end of the discussion. It's not the end of this definition in general. There's going to be further places to explore. And that's just a brief rundown of how, you know, I might get started on a paper. I know some of y'all do it differently. However you choose to write your papers, of course, is your own choice. I would just say that make sure you're only choosing one term from the list provided in the prompt. And then make sure you understand that, I think above all else, every detail, every example that follows your thesis statement is clearly linked to it. That I won't look at your thesis statement and then look at a body paragraph and say, wow, I don't know how we got from here to here. Your paper needs to be organic. In other words, each body paragraph, just like in this example, clearly ties back to your thesis statement. If you can do that, you can shoot for a combination of claims and examples in body paragraphs. You can engage your reader and introduce your topic and thesis in your intro. And then you can walk that line between getting off topic and repetition in your conclusion. You will do absolutely well on essay number 1. Best of luck. If as you're drafting any stage of the process you want some feedback, y'all, feel free to get in touch. Use this as a model for exploring your own topic of choice. Best of luck, y'all. Again, if I can help, let me know. Bye.